Racist cop accuses black girl of theft, but her grandfather's arrival turns the tables. The town of Willowbrook was softly golden in late afternoon sun. Children's laughter resonated near the fountain as the soft hum of life permeated the air and the slight scent of fresh bread and flowers stayed from the weekend market walk slowly, appreciating vivid displays from the sellers who boldly displayed their handcrafted items had a quiet day. The type that made everything seem comfortable and safe, while Leah Robinson, a 19-year-old college student, sat silently on a park seat. Student turned her phone around with a smile pulling at the corners of her lips, having just finished her first interview for a coveted internship in a law company, a job she had been dreaming of since the start of her legal studies. Wearing a fresh white shirt and well-ironed pants, she radiated the kind of confidence that resulted from knowing she had performed well. Layla was cautiously optimistic even though her heart was beating with post-interview anxiety. The kind of person who thought that diligence will always pay off felt today, as she sat there, evidence of that. She was totally oblivious that anything may change as she savored the sun's warmth and the noises of the town surrounding her. Go wrong to everyone walking by. She was simply a young woman doing her own business on a park seat, but not everyone observed her that way. Experienced cop Carter, unknown for his stern pride, ed oneself on keeping Willowbrook safe even if that meant his attitude, had been patrolling the area for hours. He was too careful as he went through the market and heard of a small theft occurring nearby. Wallet from one of the market booths. The description was at best a young woman, maybe dressed in black. Not very interesting, but Carter's eyes looked about the assembly for someone who met the description when he came upon Lila seated by herself, clothed smartly but devoid of any indication of market interaction or shopping bags. She immediately caught Carter's suspicions grew when his eyes saw something about her seated concentration on her phone. He approached. Her slow, deliberate motions caused his eyes to narrow as he examines her. Layla did not. First, she was lost in contemplation, mentally revisiting the interview and envisioning what the future might hold. Grasped, then looked up. Startled Officer Carter as a shadow passed over her. Stood there tall above her, her icy demeanor sending shivers down her spine. "Excuse me, Miss Carter's voice." Layla blinked, perplexed by sharp cutting through the calm surroundings. "What you are doing here?" she remarked pleasantly, but her unexpected intrusion is only waiting for my transportation. Heart started to rush for your journey. Carter's eyes ran over her. From her immaculately done hair down to her business shoes. "We have recorded a theft in this location. You wouldn't know anything about that." Would naturally catch Layla totally off guard, her face clenched in uncertainty. "A steal, none of which I know anything about," she answered, her voice quivering slightly, trying to understand the circumstances Carter's attitude suggested. "Hardened you suit the picture," he described exactly, a young woman seated by herself. "Mind if I peek through your suitcase?" Lee's heart skipped a beat. "What I haven't seen?" "Steal everything," she muttered, and she could see the eyes. She felt incredulity. Several people surrounding her now turned toward the scene, interested whispers already starting to flow over the square. "Just let me see the bag," Carter urged now. Less of a plea, more of a demand. Of an order. Layla hesitated. She had not done anything illegal, and this wasn't proper. Yet here she was being regarded as a criminal for just sitting in a park. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed the strap from her little handbag. "Why are you doing this?" "I informed you you wouldn't mind if I checked. I know nothing about a theft. My grandfather is picking me up right now." "Your bag," Carter answered, his voice empty of any empathy the audience around had. Grew their whispers more audible. Layla could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment. Leah gently, slowly watched her being questioned with no other choice and a terrible feeling in her chest. Given her bag, she intended to complain in order to defend herself, but worry stayed anchored to the spot. She observed in quiet as Carter rumbled through her possessions, extracting her wallet. From her interview, she had a phone and a notebook, but there was nothing save a stolen wallet. No evidence of misbehavior, but it didn't seem to matter. Carter didn't apologize. He crossed his arms and stared at her with the same icy, suspicious eyes. "You're not off the target." He didn't back down. "Connection, but I'll need you to visit the station to probe him," statedly. Lee's head flew. This truly occurring? And how could something so basic? She could feel her cheeks burning as sitting on a park seat resulted in this. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. People were embarrassedly staring at her as though she were guilty even though she had done nothing wrong. She looked about looking for a friendly face someone may jump in and say, but nobody did. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with contempt, most basically with. Her throat was tight as she reached for her phone using shaky hands. She hushed her voice barely as she phoned her granddad. "Steady, I need you to come as a police officer charging me of stealing II." Her grandfather's cool, steady voice on the other end of the line offered her a meager sense of comfort. Comfort. "I'm on my way. Layla, stay where you are." She hung up the phone, gazed at Carter, her anxiety now blending with a great sense of injustice she had experienced. Always feel that if you followed the guidelines, the world would treat you fairly. But now, as she stood, she wasn't sure the formerly quiet and lively plaza now, since she was accused of a crime she did not commit. Layla, feeling choked, stood by herself among the throng and felt the weight of every look, every whisper, every judgment. The planet had changed in a few minutes. And Layla sat frozen, her heart frozen. She knew how to make it right once more. Officer Carter loomed over her, her hammering, trying to make sense of what was occurring. His expression stern, and his voice as stern as he reiterated his charge. "We have a theft report." He claimed his eyes were fixed, and you fit the picture the words described. Layla opened her mouth to answer, like a blow emptying her lungs. Yet for a moment no sound emerged. The charge sounded too ridiculous to be true. She had been there minding her own business, waiting for her grandfather. How could she possibly be involved in anything like this? "I don't know," she at last managed to say. Her voice trembles. "I have not taken anything during my whole stay." But Carter was not paying attention. Layla could see his mind fully formed in. His gaze met her not as a human but more as a suspect that fit the. He repeated his tone, hardening. "A young woman seated by herself." Lee's stomach turned over near the market. How could anything so ambiguous be sufficient to justify this kind of treatment? A young woman sitting alone might have been anyone. Why her? The question repeated in her thoughts, but she knew the response she would. Could observe it in the way people were beginning to view her. Their eyes darting with suspicion, judgment, and something else she couldn't quite pinpoint. "I didn't do anything," Leah mentioned, voice strong in spite of her growing terror in her chest. "I've been sitting here waiting for my grandfather." Carter's reaction didn't change. He showed no interest in what she had to say. "Let me check your bag." She glanced as he held out his hand. Layla's breath stuck in her throat. Down in her little handbag, the one she had meticulously packed that morning with only the basics: her wallet, her phone, a few notes from her interview. There was nothing to conceal, and yet the idea of turning it over seemed like a transgression she knew she hadn't committed. However, the way Carter treated her made her feel terrible, as though her innocence didn't matter. "Why are you doing this?" asked softly, her voice hardly above a whisper. "I told you I hadn't done anything. Just give me the bag." Carter mentioned, his voice tight with irritation. Leah could feel the weight of their eyes on her, whispers mixing together in a swarm around her. She looked up, looking for a familiar face, as low hum made her skin crawl. Someone who might intervene and say something, but nobody moved. She simply watched her like she was. Her hands shook as she reached for her bag, some sort of show playing out for their enjoyment. Leather straps slinking slightly. When she passed it to Officer Carter, unpacked it silently, violently, and sifting through her possessions as though she were not even present there. Layla watched her heart. She wanted to shout, to hammering, her breath coming in brief, quick gasps. Yell that she had only stood there feeling little, hence this wasn't fair, as she hadn't done anything wrong. And powerless as her planet fell around her, the whispers of the throng became louder as Carter kept searching. Lila could hear snippets of their talks, some people supporting the police while others voiced uneasiness at what they were seeing, yet nobody volunteered to assist her. Nobody spoke out about what was happening. Someone asked their questions. "She seems to be under search," voice inquisitive mixed with mistrust. Another person responded, "Had to have done something." Layla's gut twisted at the Words, she felt the heat rising in her cheeks, her hands shaking at her sides. She attempted to remain composed, but with every second that went by, it was getting harder. The shame was like a heavy weight she couldn't get away from. Carter at last finished searching her luggage, coming empty-handed. He looked at her, his expression unclear, before snapping. The bag closed and swung back to her, Leah, whose fingers caught it uncomfortably, awkward with shock. "Nothing here," he said, his voice flat, but instead of. Carter's brows narrowed. "You're not off the hook yet. I'll require you to apologize or admit his error." Come down to the station to challenge, the words hanging in the air, and for a second Leah couldn't believe what she was looking at. Her suitcase was empty, hence there was no evidence to justify keeping treatment her like this. But Carter wasn't letting it go. He was resolved to make her guilt persisted even in the absence of evidence of any wrongdoing I could find. "Haven't done anything." Her voice is shaking now. Her confidence is fading. "Why are you dragging me in?" "You came across nothing that would suggest you are innocent," Carter responded angrily. Layla's chest clenched. "This. You fit the description." Wasn't only about the theft. This was something more. She had heard about all her life, but never, since she was a young black woman, she was being treated this manner, and felt she would experience herself. Her appearance was reflecting. Woman sitting by herself in a park rapidly overcame her anxiety to produce a strong feeling of her heart pounding. Injustice. She felt her hands tighten into fists at her sides. The weight of the circumstances established here was unfair. This was not right, but she was alone. What could she do? The audience was observing, but no one was assisting. Her pocket buzzed with a phone, which she hastily snatched with shaky fingers, dialing her grandfather's number. A little solace came from the familiar sound of the phone ringing, but it wasn't enough to quiet the tempest of emotions running inside her. "Grandpa," she whispered when he responded, "I need you to come. A police officer accusing me of theft. I have no idea what to do." Grandfather's voice was calm, consistent. "I'm on my way, Leah. Stay where you are." Her hands still shaking, she hung up the phone and turned once again to face the throng. Their eyes stayed on her, motionless. Suspected, Leah felt a lump develop in her throat, but she refused to cry. Swallowing it down would not provide them the gratification. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, as she stood there waiting for her grandfather to arrive. The world her felt strange, as like she was caught in a dream. She could not wake from the whispers of the throng, the whispers of strangers evaluating her without knowledge of her or concern for the truth. And through it all, Officer Carter stood there staring at her with the same icy detachment. She was just. Leah stood in the middle of the expanding suspect, another name on a report. Overwhelm her feelings, a tempest of uncertainty and dread, wrath and confusion, directed toward her grandfather. Charles Robinson was the only person she could consider calling, the only one with the will to manage this. The minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour. Whispers around her. She kept her eyes down, fiercely clutching her phone, telling herself to be calm. Then, at last, she noticed Charles Robinson approaching with deliberate steps. His tall stature drew attention without asking for it. His presence was serene but strong, the sort of quiet authority derived from a lifetime of experience rather than from conceit's basis. Face aged and wise, revealed a great awareness of the inequities of the world he had spent decades in. As he approached their gathering, it seemed as though he sensed it too, trying to change the crowd. Murmur helped to ease the stress, moving even Officer Carter, who had been so very stiff and uncompromising, wavered for only a second when he saw Charles's approach lacked consistency. Power the police identified, but something more, the presence of a guy seen more than his fair share of fights against injustice. Charles arrived at Lee's side, offering comfort. Palm on her shoulder. "Love." His voice was soft yet underlying it set of steel. While Leah nodded, her voice stuck in her throat. Just having him, she felt a little more grounded and safer. He turned to face Officer Carter, and his countenance changed to one of quiet seriousness. He questioned, yet his tone made it clear what's going on here. Evident he already had a decent understanding. It wasn't a question so much as a guide for the officer to justify himself. Carter straightened his shoulders. He mentioned a theft that had been reported, but now his voice lacked. The confidence this young woman possessed earlier this year fits exactly. Charles's eyes matched the tiniest trace of incredulity in an eyebrow. The description, he repeated, his voice calm but cutting, and what precisely is? That description made Carter stop a young woman alone close to the market, he murmured at last. But even as the words came out of his mouth, he seemed to understand how thin they sounded. Charles said nothing for a minute, allowing the silence to envelop them dense with unsaid words. Charges are that Charles silently requested a hazy picture of a woman sitting by herself. No additional specifics, no proof of guilt. Carter changed, glancing uneasily at the gathering of people gathered around them. Some of the bystanders were beginning to scowl, whispering in subdued tones. The change was evident. What had started as informal curiosity was now transforming into something more like contempt. A few people, seeing Charles's serene assurance, seemed to experience, realizing that this was not as clear-cut as they had first thought. "I am merely following procedure," Carter advised, though the remarks rang hollow. "We reported a theft, and she what?" Charles interrupted, his voice still steady, but with an edge that caused the officer, a young black woman, to stop. "In a park minding her own thing." Carter launched his own crime here. Lips to answer, but nothing came out. He was accustomed to having situational control, used to be the one who controlled how things turned out, but now, fronting Charles, that control was eluding his fingers. Charles stepped forward and looked, never leaving Carter's. "I asked this officer gently if my grandchild sitting here, with lighter complexion, would you have approached her with the same mistrust? Examined her luggage in front of all these people without a single piece of proof." The officer's cheeks flushed and he looked around once again, his unease rising as the audience stayed concentrated on him. The whispers were louder now, and Charles could feel the weight of the community behind him. This was about more than just Lila. Something far more significant than the unspoken reality everyone in that square was starting to grasp. "Charles sees." Continued, his voice remained calm. "This isn't the first time anything like this has happened, not in this town, but elsewhere. This nation follows a pattern whereby one assumes blame based only on skin color and today's circumstances. I just created my granddaughter a part of that pattern." Carter stared down, his hands fumbling SLLY at his sides. He murmured while working, but there was no conviction behind the words. Charles shook his head. "Performing your duty of protection and service to guarantee justice is done. Yet what you have done here today is either wrong or protection based on profiling." Now the throng was practically hushed, their eyes flickering between Charles and Carter. While some of them nodded in accord, others stood silently, maybe uneasy with the facts being presented naked in front of them, but nobody could dispute what was happening. None could look at the circumstances and fail to observe it. For "I followed procedure." What? Carter swallowed hard. He said once more, but the words were feeble now, hardly more than a whisper, and Charles echoed, "What? Protocol lets you publicly humiliate an innocent woman for no reason whatsoever. Officer, you have done here. Ignore her rights and consider her as guilty unless proven innocent." Before her first chance to speak, "You made my granddaughter guilty in the view of this throng." Carter felt genuinely unsure of his power, which had seemed so unquestionable. When he initially went to Layla, she was collapsing under the weight of Charles's comments, and he could sense the gaze of the throng on him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could defend his behavior. "Charles sensed the change pressed upon you. You examined her luggage and discovered nothing, and yet you still want to bring her in for inquiry as she fits the description, or since she's black and seated in a public area." And that made the officer dubious. He stood there without answering, his fists now closed at his sides, his face flushed with humiliation. He wasn't used to someone standing up to him with such calm authority. "I know, being questioned like this," Charles, the law officer, stated gently. "I spent my whole career upholding it, and not only is what you have done here today illegal, you have also violated her rights and done it under full view of this group. I advise you to let my granddaughter leave and apologize. We can then present this to the courts, where I swear you will lose the threat hanging in the air, and for a little minute Carter seemed likely to dispute. Then he turned back to Charles and noticed the unflinching belief in his eyes that he was right, and though he knew deep down he wasn't yet sorry, he moved back. Charles had won this round, and they both knew the fight would change from his stance. Leah was silently standing next to her grandfather and felt relief mixed with. Kayen's grandfather was powerful, and with pride she had always known. Yet, seeing him here vehemently defending her helped her to see just how much power derived from that strength, although the officer might not have admitted his. Ere she understood, he would never forget this moment. Layla was by her grandfather's SI. To her heart still, rushing from the overpowering experience, she could see the weight of their silent judgment reflected in the eyes of the audience. Still hovering in the air, but now with Charles firmly at her side, she sensed something else too, a flutter of strength, a little but developing sense of empowerment. This was not only her struggle, but also more than hers and her grandfather's presence made it abundantly evident. Charles did not waver as he stared directly at Officer Carter. Voice was steady, yet it clearly had an edge of command in it. "You owe my granddaughter an apology," he stated, not only for her treatment but also for today, but for the system allowing this to continue for others like her. You view her as a suspect because of her skin tone is not only incorrect, it also reflects a more fundamental problem we have been battling generations. Carter moved uneasily, his mouth stiffening as the words hung in the air. He looked about, maybe expecting some audience support, but all he saw faces full of subdued excitement. Everyone was waiting to see what he would do next, whether he would admit what had happened or keep denying it. "I was merely following procedure," he repeated, but this time the words seemed hollow even to him. "I had cause to believe reason." Charles cut in his voice more sharply now. "What reason did you have to accuse her other than the fact she was sitting here silently, minding her own business?" A nebulous description of a young. "That is not reason sufficient to publicly humiliate someone. You inspected her possessions in front of all these people, without any single piece of proof contradicting protocol." Layla could sense her. The whispers had ceased, and the square had resonated not only with her, but also with the throng. Grandfather's words spoke to both. Went quiet, as though the town was holding its breath to wait for Carter's answer, but the officer simply stood there stiff and silent, reluctant to offer ground. When Charles's dream started to stray, she considered what had lately been repeatedly repeating it in her brain, sitting there doing nothing wrong, and yet before she could even have a chance to speak, immediately she had been labeled as a thief, guilty. Injustice of it burned in her chest, and considered how many more others had have felt the same way, judged, accused, all due of how they behaved. Though she had heard about it all her life, living, experiencing it was different. It was smothering, and she felt small and helpless. Then she looked at her grandfather, and he wasn't backing down. Layla recognized he wasn't letting the officer's authority scare him at that same instant. Something significant. She wasn't helpless. She spoke just like her grandfather did, and she had every right to defend herself in order to demand justice. This went beyond her alone. Now it was about rebating against the system that had been mistreating people just like her for far too long. Charles's words returned her to the present. "You may consider this to be just related to today's Officer Carter, but it's not this kind of event that occurs daily to someone looking like my granddaughter. Every time it does, chips away at the faith we are supposed to have in the individuals assigned to guard us. You say you were following protocol, but we need more than simply justification. We need." Al could see the conflict playing out. Responsibility permeated the dense tension between Charles and Carter. Looking on the officer's face, he sought to defend himself, to support his behavior. But the throng, the circumstances, and Charles's steady logic had deprived him of any actual defense. "Still, I'm not going to stand here and quarrel with you, Sir," Carter remarked. He refused to apologize. Voice tight. "I have work to do, and I did it." Charles shook his head, disappointed. Carved in his features. "You worked today." "Sure," he answered gently, "but it wasn't. Your employment should have been serving justice rather than supporting injustice. Your rejection of this would have. Admit that is the true issue here. Layla felt a flood of emotions come through her and had been embarrassed in front of a gathering, handled like a criminal without cause, but now seeing her grandfather got up to the officer, hearing his comments reflected the truth she had been experiencing inside, and provided a. She had not felt a sense of direction before this, not only about cleaning her name. She wasn't alone the crowd, it was about defending what was right. Around them, Leah saw people nodding, murmurs of change as well. Agreement rippling through the square. Several of the suspiciously observing faces turned to face her. Understanding, maybe even sympathy, the awareness was subdued but strong. She was part of something more than just a victim now, a greater struggle against the type of injustice that had occurred. Just performed in front of all these people. Carter crossed his arms, not ready to give up entirely. His face hardened once more over his chest. "I worked," he repeated, despite there was less conviction in his voice now. If there was a problem with it, you could address with the department. Charles did not miss a beat. "We will," he stated firmly. "Officer, this is not the at the end of this. We will address this with the department and, should we have to, with the courts. Today won't go without." Layla felt a flash of pride rising inside her. Grandfather was speaking up for everyone who had ever been treated like this, not only for her. She understood as she stood next to him that she too wanted to join that fight. She wouldn't allow this slip. Neither was Charles as the officer shuffled uneasily, evidently eager to leave the situation behind. Charles turned to Lila. His demeanor smoothed the sharp edges of confrontation, vanishing while he gazed at her with the deep concern and protection only a grandfather could. "Have we not let this go?" he murmured softly, but his words were full of will to ensure this never occurs to you or anybody else. Layla nodded, her feeling whirling between a sense of relief, pride, and a residual sense of injustice. She had experienced helplessness beginning, but later she realized that wasn't the truth. This wasn't over by a long time shot, and knowing she had the strength to go on the battle with her grandfather at her side, the audience, perceiving the moment nearing close, started to fade slowly. However, the weight of what had happened hung in the air. Officer Carter, still reluctant to own his error, gave Charles and Lila one last look before turning, and Leah was walking away, the stiffness in his posture, clearly frustrated. Watched him go, her heart still racing. But this time, she felt something else than shame or guilt. Elsa Willis sensed that what had transpired today mattered, and that they weren't done yet. Charles squeezed Leah softly, raised her shoulder, and gazed up at him. "We will bring this right up to the conclusion," remarked gently. "This is not only about you, but also about all of us." And Lila, feeling the whole weight of those remarks, knowing he was correct. In the days after the confrontation, Lila could not shake. Though the shock of the incident had not faded, the weight of all that had transpired now, as she sat across from Charles, was adamant in his conviction that what her grandfather in his living room had created was only starting work, could not be left unanswered. Leah had been harmed not only by Officer Carter, but they both realized this wasn't only an issue with a system allowing such behavior to continue unbridled. Isolated incidents, and neither of them was the kind to let something so vital slip. Together they filed a formal complaint on Officer Carter and the Willowbrook Police Department. Charles, with his years of legal experience, knew exactly how to negotiate the process, and his presence gave legitimacy that made it impossible for Layla observed him work, and the department decided to overlook every aspect, learning from him. Even if her emotions were still a flurry of confusion, she trusted her grandfather, and his determination gave her strength. But she hadn't anticipated the flurry of interest that followed. News of the occurrence, which began as a local discourse, suddenly burst on social media. Videos taken by onlookers during the confrontation went viral, and Layla's name started to trend alongside hashtags demanding responsibility from people all around, when some providing words of support. Some accused her of using the RC card, but Layla wasn't overwhelmed by sudden attention. Ready for it, she had desired justice, not glory, and now her face spoke her story. Everywhere, she found it difficult to understand. She had always been the kind of person that wanted to remain out of the limelight, concentrating on her studies and ambitions, but now she found herself at the center of a developing movement, whether she approved of it or not. Messages of support sent her on how brave she was. Others bombarded her inbox with nasty remarks accusing her of exaggerating events from nothing. Lee's emotional toll was significant, and for some time she struggled to manage it. Charles stayed consistent, although he had seen this type of reaction previously. Having spent years working as a civil rights attorney, he understood how to keep Lila rooted. This is part of the struggle he shared with her one evening when he stood up for what was right, and the pressure was intolerable. Though not everyone will be on your side, you have to keep in mind why you are doing this. Bigger than Leah. She recognized that the words about making sure no one else has to go through what you did remained with her. The messages of support meant something. They were not only for her, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted. Gently started to embrace her new role, discovering her voice in the process. It was not simple. Still experienced periods of uncertainty about whether she could bear the weight of so many people's hopes, but Charles was always there to remind her that this was about justice for the community and beyond, not only for her. With Charles at her side, she began organizing community events. It was terrifying when Lila told her tale, not as a victim, but as someone prepared to battle for change. Initially fronting all those people, she could see the effect her words were having on people as she talked. Listen, they understood, and shortly the talks they were having weren't somewhat about her, but also about the institutional problems allowing this kind of racial profiling to occur. Initially, Leah grew into her position as an advocate. She wasn't more the more she talked. She was now fighting for everyone who had ever been wrongly judged due of the legitimate struggle for herself. The color of their skin let her know that by sharing her experience, she could influence something. Change the story. The community started to support her, and what had started as a local concern was now acquiring focus on a far more extensive scale. The police department, on its part, aimed at. Eventually, they gave a vague response recognizing the incident, but refusals to take any accountability. Instead of an apology or admitting of error, they talked about continuous internal studies and following procedures, but everyone could clearly see pain. Their attempt to brush the entire area under the rug simply served to aggravate the community's resentment. Desired justice for Lila and for every other victim who had been singled out by the system. As Lee's confidence developed, she found herself at demonstrations. Each time she spoke, the words came easier. She didn't have to stand in front of throngs supporting the cause. Just discuss what had happened to her. She discussed how it fit a greater pattern, one that required dismantled. She discussed the need of police reform, about the need of making people in charge answerable for their acts, and with every speech and conference, she sensed herself developing more definite of her place in this struggle. The climax arrived one sunny afternoon, when Leah and Charles organized a nonviolent demonstration on the town square of Willowbrook, the square formerly a venue she had visited. Now hundreds of people all stood together in support, held signs, humiliated and accused was filled with, that demanded justice for responsibility for change. And as Layla stood front of the gathering observing, she felt hope she had not known conceivable out at the sea of faces. This was more than she had previously known. Now, it was abundantly evident that change was within grasp. The community had gathered behind her, not only because of what had transpired, but also because of them. Understood it was a component of something more than one incidence of racial profiling. It was about. Layla turned to see her grandfather standing over a system that had let it run far too long. He had been her rock through all of this, silently proud beside her. She knew she couldn't have done any of this when she felt lost, reminding her of the value of the war they were in without him. But now, as she stood there, she saw this was her road, because she had discovered her voice and the will to keep advocating justice. Leah picked the microphone one last time as the demonstration came to an end. "We cannot," she said, her voice firm and strong, "but we can make changes based on what occurred to me. Sure, it doesn't happen once more. This battle is all of ours, not only mine. Working together, we may demand justice for the crowd by altering the system." Burst into cheers, and Lila gazed out over them, knowing that the struggle for justice was only starting. Wasn't done, but with the help of her community and the strength she had discovered, She was ready to set the example. She believed inside herself that they could bring about the necessary transformation for the world. The path from a quiet aspirational student to a voice of opposition was complete. Lila wasn't only. Now she was speaking up for everyone who had been wronged by a flawed system. As the sun set above Willowbrook, one felt that change was about to arrive and that this was only the start. Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.